Descent. Hillar File 4991.09 by R.A. Howes. .01. Beings from all over the galaxy filled the large corridor. Most were Tehran, like Eric, but he found the vast range of subspecies unusual. The smell of chemwash and engine grease was overpowering as he dodged past some of the slower-moving groups in the crowd. Dirt, grease, and the flaking of age stained the surrounding concrete. Some of its metal supports were visible. The metal grillwork that served as a floor groaned under the constant weight of the passengers. The flow of the crowd toward the center of the space station was uneven. Just as it thinned out and the spaces between the groups widened, the floor-to-ceiling airlocks along the walls opened and more passengers emerged, packing the space as tight as before. The sounds of laughter, tears, and many languages and conversation filled the corridor. Ferncorns with their cloven feet clipped on the grillwork as they walked. Their tiny horns glinted in the uneven lighting around them. Canis types moved in small packs. The dog DNA spliced into them showed in their elongated faces, pointed teeth, and fur on their heads. A group of aliens passed through the crowd, their multiple limbs reflecting oily colors as they moved constantly. Eric tried to avoid staring at them, but found the shifting of their extra joints fascinating. Behind them were large, worm-like creatures that left a trail of slime in their wake. A team of cleanbots followed the cornucopia, chittering to themselves as they tried to remove the thick goo. Eric's almost 2.5 meters of height made him taller than most of those around him. Over the heads of the crowd, he could see others leaning against the corridor walls in groups of 4 more. They were not in a rush to leave the docks. Some had red sashes tied around their arms, denoting them as Cyrus's security teams. Others had a cluster of lines tattooed on their throats, designating them as slaver gangs. Running the advice from the ship's crew through his mind, he glanced at another group. They were devoid of any identifying marks. Bounty hunters. All of them carried rifles, gun belts, and the occasional cybernetic enhancement. Adjusting the weight of his backpack, Eric tried to edge inconspicuously into the center of the corridor. He hoped his calculated slow pace would keep wandering eyes from being attracted to his movement. He glanced down, realizing he was rubbing at the scar. The harder skin ran from the center of his palm and down over his wrist. It was only noticeable from the rest of the red-brown coloring when he touched it, and he only found himself touching it when he had that prickle of unease or a cold feeling of being watched. Ahead of him, a tiny woman was carrying a young girl. Her cheek was pink as she lifted it off her mother's shoulder to stare at him. Pale gray, almost white eyes were shining in the dimness. Her light frame and elongated features made her look more like an ethereal creature than a Tehran child. "Mummy, he looks funny." The translator in his ear changed her words into his native tongue. Despite understanding her, Eric was not used to the more formal style of language it created. At the girl's voice, the woman turned and tilted her head sharply to look at him. Eric smiled as he stammered an apology. "Do not worry about it." As her own translator blinked in response to his words, Eric slowed a little more and leaned down to help with the large bag she was carrying. "I am probably a strange sight to a few people." She smiled in return. "We have never seen so many subspecies," she admitted as they moved further down the corridor. "Or aliens." She glanced about them at the crowd. Eric followed her gaze, using the opportunity to check on those groups. They appeared more interested in the knots of people near them. The tightness in his shoulders eased a bit. "You from Mars?" His steps faltered as he processed the direct question. And the time it took for him to recover, she shifted uncomfortably. Sweat beaded her forehead as he glanced around them. "The skin or the tattoos?" Eric ran his hand over his bald head at the mention of the ink. She relaxed a little and adjusted the girl on her shoulder. "A bit of both, I guess." They paused as the crowd grew too thick to navigate. "You?" "Singori sector, one of the space stations." She shifted again, standing almost directly under the light. Her skin reflected it harshly. Eric winced from its brightness. He shook his head while his eyes adjusted. "We have a family here," she added. The knot of people moved, allowing them to continue forward. Decided things were good for a fresh start. "Here." Eric could not keep his surprise out of his tone. "On Sirius." "All space stations need workers." The knowing look she gave Eric left him wordless for a moment. "Mechanics, electricians, cleaners, even out here on the rim. Without workers, things stop." He nodded, her words pointing out to him what should have been obvious. "Do you think that they'll need a cook?" Once he voiced it, Eric mulled over his question, tasting the word as something new, something unexpected. To be honest, I had not really thought about what I would do once I got here. Few people do. She was looking away from him now, scanning the crowd around them as they moved closer to the core. But she turned back to him. You do not exactly look the part of a cook. Eric shrugged and glanced at his hand, the scar left by the tightness of the skin. Gotta have cooks on every planet, even Mars. Of course. She caught the sight of something near the entrance to the core. Raising herself up on her toes, she waved. Eric followed her gaze to see a small group of similar-looking Terrans to her. Do yourself a favor. She took the bag from him and adjusted her daughter on her shoulder again. Find someone that you trust to watch your back. She looked behind them down the corridor. Solo travelers get dead fast out here. Thanks for the advice. Eric smiled at the little girl, barely hearing her mother's words. Good luck with your fresh start. You too. She started heading toward her family, then stopped and turned to look at him one last time. Thank you for your help. You kept us safe too. Eric shook his head, laughing quietly at the accurate reading of his offered help. She hooked her bag over her free shoulder and nodded a farewell. The little girl waved at him. He returned the gesture before focusing on the path ahead. He stepped out of the corridor into the core and moved to the side for a moment, processing the sight. The entrance Eric walked through was not the only one. Around the ring, several large corridors spewed crowds into the core. The enormous space was a single layer in a large, many-leveled sphere. The crowd flowed past, making their way to the elevator that ringed the edge of the walkway. In the sphere's center, vehicles moved up and down in orderly lines. Landsleds, small transports, and even some single motors hitched to platforms were parked along the edge, their drivers soliciting their rides to the passers-by. Against the outer wall, hawkers had set up small shops. Some were a mere table with some data chips, others containers full of equipment and stock. There was even an eatery, Coolio's. The hamburgers sat in a warmer, slowly disintegrating from the grease in their meat. Eric's stomach churned as he walked closer to the wall in the cellars. He stepped near a small table and the merchant looked up at him. The sound of a horn screamed through the noise of engines and people. Many heads turned toward the core. Other horns blared and transports scattered out of their lanes as a red landsled wove through them. The blonde Terran at the controls, oblivious to the responses of others, she twisted and turned the landsled at an insane speed. Crazies, the man behind the table muttered as the commotion settled. If it wasn't for their money, the harbor master would toss the lot off the station. Eric rubbed at his goatee, turning back to the Terran and his table full of parts. The failure of the system, he shrugged. She will not survive long driving like that, though. The merchant returned the shrug, and he looked at Eric properly for the first time. New? Fresh off the carrier. Eric glanced around. Like most of those here, I imagine. He did not react as the man's face broke into a sly smile. You need a chip. The Terran held up a chip, then pulled a chip reader out of his pocket and inserted it. A small hologram of the space station appeared above the screen. This little beauty connects directly to the mainframe of the station. It has continuous updates and tells you your location. He manipulated the image until it zoomed in to show a level of the core at the very bottom of the station. A single yellow beacon blinked at them. Can throw in a chip of the local dialects, too. He glanced at Eric's ear. Your translator looks like it can cope with upgrades. How much? 5 trade credits. Eric sighed and waved the item away. Fresh off the carrier, remember? Only got UTC creds. Well, those aren't worth a lot out here. His smile got even wider. It'll be 15 of those. Eric looked at the map again, weighing up the need for the information against the hit to the credits he had. Deciding it was worth the cost, he pulled a credit disc out of his inner jacket pocket and slipped it through the offered card reader. The man nodded as the transaction went through. So, Eric watched as the merchant put the reader away. Who will you get to change those credits over? The merchant's sly look reappeared. Wondering who to trust? Do not want it to be too obvious I am fresh off the carrier. He laughed quietly at Eric's counter and pointed along the wall to a woman several stalls away. That's Janice. She will give you a fair trade of UTC credits. He blinked. She will make money, no doubt about that, but she will not gouge the lifeblood from you or tell the local press gang what you are carrying. Some of us still have a code here, unlike those crazies on the trade levels. Thanks. Eric nodded a farewell and headed toward Janice. He waited as she served several of the slug-looking aliens. She seemed to know them, laughing at their strange clicks. Eric pulled his translator out of his ear and clipped the small chip into the slot. By the time he had fitted it back comfortably, Janice was looking at him. Yes. Her question and expression neutral as she looked up. Eric haggled exchange rates with her for a few minutes. Happy with their deal, he headed towards the elevator, not really knowing exactly where he was going, but deciding that it was safer to keep moving. Joining the end of a group, he got into the next one that arrived. His nose crinkled as the acrid smell of chemwash from them all intensified in the enclosed space. He checked the control panel near the closing doors. It had 3 options written in the Turan language, known as trade. Docks, residential, trade. Eric braced himself as the elevators powered on. He could see the scratches in the rough plastic windows as they quivered from the force of their air pressing outside. Hundreds of levels flew by, all filled with thousands of beings. The elevator slowed, then stopped at the residential levels. Most of the crowd got out, giving those left some arm room. Eric pulled the chip reader out again as the elevator headed up through the core, towards the trade levels. He opened the map, noting the landing level of the elevator he was on. A single bar took up most of it. The map called it Rebeal, and a note advised it was currently closed for repairs. Eric skimmed the layout of the rest of the area. A cave-like structure of winding pathways and shops split over the floor into mezzanines. He powered the chip reader down and slipped it back into his pocket. Readjusting the strap of his backpack, he leaned against the wall and watched the levels go by.